The wheelchair hit frozen pavement like a gunshot. 1 second she was sitting beside a dark reservoir, alone, grieving, minding her own business. The next second, a man with a badge had grabbed her chair and shoved, and Leah Carver was on the ground, palms bleeding, cheek pressed against cold Idaho stone. Nobody was supposed to see that. 50 yards away, a man nobody in Helena Ridge had ever noticed stood very, very still, and his dog stopped breathing. What happened next would expose a pattern of abuse hiding behind a uniform, drag one woman's worst night into a county-wide reckoning, and force a broken soldier to decide whether he still had something worth fighting for. If this kind of story hits you somewhere real, subscribe right now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit like before we're done. Now let's go back to that November night in Idaho. The wind came off the reservoir mean and without warning, the way Idaho wind does in November. Not as a gust, but as a wall, flat and indifferent, carrying the smell of ice and pine and something darker underneath, like wet stone that had never once seen warmth. Leah Carver pulled her coat tighter across her chest and didn't move. She'd been sitting at the edge of the Alder Creek Preserve Trail for the better part of an hour, parked at the exact spot where the paved path curved away from the parking lot and opened up toward the reservoir. From this point, on a clear day, you could see the far tree line and the mountain ridge beyond it, pale and sharp against whatever sky was left. Tonight the sky was the color of ash. The mountains had disappeared entirely. The reservoir was a black mirror, and Leah sat with her gloved hands folded in her lap, staring at the water like it owed her something. She was 25 years old. She was wearing the same charcoal coat she'd worn to the funeral. She hadn't taken it off in 4 days. 3 days ago, she had stood, or rather, had been wheeled, to the front of St. Catherine's in downtown Helena Ridge, while a priest said words about her sister Claire that were technically accurate and completely hollow. Claire Ann Carver, 31 years old, taken suddenly, beloved daughter, devoted sibling. Leah had sat in the front row in her chair and stared at the casket and thought, he didn't know her at all. He's describing a greeting card. Claire had been the one who drove 2 hours each way to take Leah to her physical therapy appointments without being asked. Claire had been the one who showed up at Leah's apartment at 11 p.m. with Thai food and terrible action movies when she heard something in Leah's voice that worried her. Claire had been the one who, after the accident, after the surgery, after the months of rehabilitation and the brutal arithmetic of what Leah would and wouldn't be able to do again, had sat beside the hospital bed and said, flatly and without ceremony, "You're still you. The chair doesn't change that. Don't let anyone tell you different." Nobody else had said it like that. Not their parents, who couldn't stop crying long enough to say anything useful. Not her doctors, who spoke in careful therapeutic language designed to manage expectations. Not her friends from college, most of whom had drifted away with the particular cowardice of people who don't know how to be around grief they didn't cause. Claire had said it like a fact, like gravity, like something that required no discussion. And now Claire was in a box, and the priest was describing a stranger, and Leah had spent 4 days wearing the same coat because taking it off felt like accepting something she wasn't ready to accept. The reservoir didn't move. Somewhere behind her, a crow called once and went silent. She had driven herself out here in the modified van she'd had for 2 years, hand controls on the steering wheel, ramp that deployed with a button, the whole adaptive package. She'd parked in the lot, wheeled herself down the paved trail to this spot, and just stopped. No plan, no agenda. She was not, she would later be very clear about this, in crisis. She wasn't standing at any kind of edge. She was just a grieving woman who needed somewhere to be that wasn't her apartment full of casserole dishes that kind neighbors had dropped off, and that made her feel suffocated by other people's sympathy. She needed air. She needed the water. She needed to not talk to anyone. The preserve was technically closed at sunset. Leah knew that. She'd been coming here for 2 years, knew the posted hours, knew the parking lot lights clicked off at 8. It was 8:24 p.m. The lot was empty. The trail was empty. She was bothering absolutely no one. She heard the cruiser before she saw it, tires on frozen gravel, the low idle of a county vehicle, headlights sweeping the tree line. She watched the lights without turning around. Here we go, she thought. Go home, officer. There's nothing to see. Deputy Nolan Price was 38 years old, 8 years on the county sheriff's force. and he was having, by his own private assessment, a genuinely terrible month. There'd been a complaint filed against him, some nonsense from a roadside stop in October that the department was looking into, which meant his supervisor, Lieutenant Garza, was watching him like a hawk, and he was stuck on the overnight perimeter rotation through Alder Creek Preserve and 2 other parks, like he was a rookie who needed babysitting. 8 years, and they had him doing park checks. He spotted the lone figure at the trail's edge before he even got out of the car, wheelchair, woman, sitting very still in the dark. He sat in the cruiser for a moment, engine running, watching. Nothing about it looked threatening. It looked, honestly, kind of sad. Some woman sitting alone at a closed park in the middle of the night. His first instinct was to leave it alone. Just drive through, log the check, move on. But Garza had told him, specifically, to document anything out of the ordinary during this rotation. And a lone woman in a wheelchair at a closed park at 8:30 at night was technically out of the ordinary. He climbed out of the cruiser. He walked toward her slowly, the gravel crunching under his boots. She heard him coming. He could tell by the slight straightening of her spine, but she didn't turn around. "Ma'am." He kept his voice level, professionally neutral. "Preserve closed at sunset. I'm going to need you to head on out." Leah turned to look at him. Her face was pale, composed. Her eyes were dry. She looked like someone who had been crying recently but was not currently crying, which in his experience meant either exhaustion or the kind of grief that had gone past the point where tears helped. "I know," she said. "I'll be heading out soon." "I need you to go now, ma'am." "I just need a few more minutes." He studied her. "You doing okay?" "I'm fine, I'll go in a few minutes." He should have let it go. The reasonable human thing to do was to say, take your time and walk back to his cruiser and sit there for 10 minutes, and then she'd leave and that would be the end of it. That was the response the situation was asking for. But there was something about her tone, not disrespectful exactly, but not immediately accommodating either, that flat, self-possessed, "I'll go in a few minutes," like she was deciding the schedule, and he was an inconvenience that snagged something in him. 8 years on this force. Some girl in a wheelchair deciding she'd leave when she felt like it. "Ma'am, this isn't a request. Park's closed. You need to go now." "I heard you," Leah said, and turned back toward the water. The back of her head. She had turned the back of her head toward him. Something in Price's chest went tight and hot. "Get your vehicle and leave. Now. Or I write you up for trespassing and you can explain it to a judge. For sitting at a park 20 minutes after closing?" She still wasn't looking at him. "You can write that up if you'd like." "Turn around when I'm talking to you." She turned. Her eyes were steady, not afraid, not aggressive, just steady. And somehow that was worse. "I'm listening," she said. "Otam." He couldn't have told you exactly when the conversation crossed from official to personal. It was a subtle thing, the way the temperature in his voice changed, dropped below professional, and kept going. He started talking about park regulations. Then he was talking about her attitude. Then he was saying things like people like you in ways that had nothing to do with park regulations. "People like me," Leah said quietly. "What does that mean?" "People who think the rules don't apply to them. I'm sitting in a park. You're trespassing in a park. After closing. Alone. In the dark." He let a beat pass. "Kind of makes you wonder." Leah looked at him for a long moment. "What does it make you wonder, officer? Whether you're actually doing okay? Or whether I need to call for a welfare check?" There it was. The implication wrapped in official-sounding language. Not a genuine offer of help. A tool. A threat. Comply or I'll make this something else. "I'm fine," Leah said, and her voice was still steady, but her hands had tightened in her lap. "I'm going to need you to back up. I'm going to need you to leave. I will leave when I'm ready." He grabbed the handle of her wheelchair. Not violent, not yet. Just his hand closing around the push handle, the way you'd grab a cart in a grocery store. The casual authority of it. "This belongs to me to move." "Don't." The word came out of her like a blade, sharp and immediate. "Do not touch my chair." "You want to go by yourself or you want me to help you out?" "I said do not." He shoved. Not a tap, not a nudge. A genuine weight-behind-it shove. The handle wrenching in his grip, the chair lurching forward, the wheels hitting a crack in the frozen pavement at exactly the wrong angle. And Leah went over.
Say.
The sound was metallic and final, like a car door slamming in an empty parking garage. The chair hit the pavement hard, one wheel spinning in the air, and Leah's body hit a half-second after, her shoulder taking the impact, her gloved palms scraping across frozen stone. The charcoal coat raked up along her left side. Her breath punched out of her lungs. She lay on the ground. She lay on the ground at a closed park in Idaho while a deputy stood over her, and the reservoir was black and silent, and the wind was the only sound. For one suspended moment, nobody moved. 50 yards up the trail, in the shadow of a cluster of bare cottonwood trees, Grant Rourke had gone completely still. He'd heard the metallic crack. He'd heard the gasp. And now he was watching a woman on the ground, and a man with a badge standing over her, and every trained instinct he possessed was processing the scene before his conscious mind had finished forming a single coherent thought. Threat assessment. Civilian down. No other units. Single aggressor. Armed. Law enforcement. His hand dropped to Bishop's collar. Not a grip, just a touch. The German Shepherd was already rigid beside him, muscles coiled, the low vibration of a growl contained somewhere deep in his chest. Easy, Grant thought. Not a word, just a pressure through the hand. Bishop felt it and held. Grant stepped out of the shadows and started walking toward the badge. People in Helena Ridge didn't notice Grant Rourke much, which was exactly how he'd intended it. He'd been in town 6 months, renting a 2-bedroom cabin on the east side of the ridge from a retired schoolteacher who was happy to take cash month to month without too many questions. He shopped at the same grocery store, got coffee from the same diner, took Bishop to the same 2 trails most mornings, and spoke to people only when spoken to first. He drove a dark green 2009 Ram 1500 with 180,000 miles on it and a small dent in the rear quarter panel that he'd never bothered fixing. He wore the same rotation of 3 flannel shirts and the same weathered Carhartt jacket that had been washed enough times to look like it had a history. He was 34 years old. He looked older. Not in a bad way, not haggard, not worn out, but seasoned, like someone who had spent a lot of time outside in weather that had opinions. 14 years in the United States Navy, the last 9 of those in the SEAL teams. 3 deployments to Afghanistan, 1 to Iraq, 2 classified rotations he would never be at liberty to discuss in any civilian context for the rest of his life. He had been, by every metric his community used to measure such things, exceptional at his job. Then, 18 months ago, a training accident in Virginia had torn his labrum, fractured his scapula, and ended the chapter. He'd had surgery. He'd rehabbed. He'd been offered desk work, an instructor billet, other options that the Navy, in its institutional way, had framed as opportunities. Grant had looked at those options and understood, with the clear-eyed honesty that was one of his better qualities, that he was not built for what came after the operational part, that he would not be good at being the person in the room who had once been the person in the field, that the gap between who he had been and what the institution was offering him would eat him alive inside of a year. So he'd gotten out. He'd driven west because west was where there was still enough space to not feel like the walls were closing in. He'd landed in Helena Ridge because he'd driven through it once on a different trip years earlier and thought vaguely that it was the kind of place a person could breathe. He'd rented the cabin. He'd tried to figure out what came next. 6 months in, he still didn't know. What he did know, his shoulder ached in the cold. Bishop was slowing down, 12 years old, the gray spreading up his muzzle now like frost on dark wood, but still sharp, still present, still the most reliable creature Grant had ever known. And walking the Alder Creek Preserve trails at night, when the parking lot was empty and the world was quiet, was the one thing that consistently made his nervous system feel something close to normal. He came out here 3-4 nights a week. Sometimes he saw the woman in the charcoal coat. She was always at the same spot, and she was always alone. And she had the particular stillness of someone who came to this place specifically to not be disturbed. He understood that completely. He'd never spoken to her. Tonight he'd been 100 yards up the trail, in the shadows of the cottonwoods, letting Bishop work a scent he'd found in the brush along the path, something small, probably a fox. When the cruiser's headlights had swept the lot, he'd watched, he'd seen, he'd heard the sound that wasn't an accident, and now he was walking. His footsteps made noise, deliberately. He wasn't trying to sneak up on anyone. Sneaking up on an armed law enforcement officer alone in a dark park was a fast way to get shot. And Grant had spent enough time in environments where getting shot was a realistic possibility to have zero interest in manufacturing the conditions voluntarily. He walked at a steady, visible pace, hands loose at his sides, body language saying, "I'm coming, I'm not hiding, I see everything." Price heard him first, then turned. He saw a man in a weathered jacket and an old German shepherd. He saw no badge, no uniform, no obvious threat. What he saw, his brain filed as civilian, uninvolved, manageable. "Sir, this area is closed. I need you to step away from her." It wasn't a shout. It wasn't aggressive. It was the tone of someone who had, in various contexts over 14 years, said things that people listened to because the alternative was worse. Quiet. Precise. The verbal equivalent of a hand on a door that's already swinging shut. Price felt the hairs on the back of his neck react before his rational mind could explain why. He covered it with authority. "Sir, I'm a county deputy." "I can see that." Grant stopped 10 feet away. He looked at Leah on the ground, then back at Price. "I watched what happened. Step away from her." "You need to leave this area, now." "No, sir." Grant's voice didn't change in any way. "I don't." The standoff held for 3 seconds. Bishop stood at Grant's left side, not lunging, not barking, just present. 12 years old and built like something that had been through a great deal and had opinions about the world as a result. His gaze was locked on Price, with the particular quality of attention that very good trained dogs have, which is the quality of having already made a calculation and simply being patient about the outcome. Price looked at the dog, then at Grant, then at Leah on the ground. The situation had, without his fully understanding how, slipped sideways. "She was trespassing. She was sitting beside a reservoir," Grant said. "Then you grabbed her wheelchair. Then you shoved it. I watched all 3 of those things happen from 50 yards. I can describe exactly what occurred, in sequence, if that would be useful." Silence. Price's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you saw." "I know exactly what I saw." Another silence. Grant let it sit. He had, over the years, learned that silence was a tool most people couldn't stand, and that the person who filled it first was usually the one who was less sure of their position. Price filled it. She was being uncooperative. She was sitting at a park. After closing, "A park closes at sunset," Grant said. "People forget. You talk to them. You don't touch their equipment." A pause. "Especially not like that." Price stared at him. The deputy's face was going through something, a series of calculations, a reassessment, the dawning of an awareness that this was not unfolding the way it should have. He looked at Leah, who had pushed herself up to a seated position on the pavement, one hand braced, her shoulder clearly hurting. She was watching Price with an expression Grant would later try to describe, and couldn't quite find the right word for. Not defiance, exactly. More like the specific look of someone who has been proved right about something they desperately wished they'd been wrong about. Price straightened. He said nothing further. He turned and walked back toward the cruiser. He stopped once, with his hand on the door, and looked back at Grant. "You embarrassed the wrong man." Grant held his gaze. He didn't respond. He had nothing to say to that. The cruiser's engine turned over. The lights swept across the tree line. And then Deputy Nolan Price of the Helena Ridge County Sheriff's Department drove away into the dark, and the sound of the engine faded, and there was just wind and reservoir and 2 people and a dog. Grant crouched down beside Leah. Not hovering, crouching, eye level, the way you did when you needed someone to know you were there without making them feel surrounded. "You okay?" Leah looked at him for a moment before answering. Her expression was the expression of someone who was doing a rapid and honest internal inventory. "My shoulder's going to bruise," she said. "My palm's scraped." A beat. "My pride's intact." "Good." He glanced at the chair. One wheel had a dent in the rim from the impact. The frame looked okay. "Can you get back in, or do you need—" "I can do it." Then immediately, "But I'll need the chair to be righted first." Grant stood, reached down, and lifted the chair carefully, checking the wheel. It would roll, if unevenly, then positioned it beside her without a word. He held it steady while she pulled herself back up. The process was clearly practiced, the movement of someone who had done this many times in controlled environments, and only somewhat in the aftermath of being shoved to the ground by a sheriff's deputy. She got in, adjusted, looked down at her hands. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to do that." "He shouldn't have touched your chair." "No, he shouldn't have." She looked up at him. "I'm Leah." "Grant." Bishop chose that moment to close the distance between them, padding over with the deliberate slowness of a very old dog who had decided something, and placed his head against Leah's knee. Not demanding attention, just making contact, the dog equivalent of sitting beside someone in the dark. Leah looked down at him. Something in her face shifted. Not broke exactly, but softened at the edges, the way a very controlled thing will soften when it encounters something unexpectedly gentle. "What's his name?" "Bishop." She put one scraped palm against the top of his gray muzzle. "Hey, Bishop?" Bishop's tail moved once, slow and deliberate. And then Leah Carver, who had not cried at her sister's funeral, who had not cried in the 4 days since wearing the same charcoal coat, pressed her lips together and started to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way exhausted people cry, quietly, with some shame about it, and also some relief, like pressure finally releasing from somewhere it had been building too long. Grant straightened up and looked at the reservoir. He gave her the silence. He'd learned, over years, that sometimes the most decent thing you could do for someone was to simply stay in the room and not make it about you. After a few minutes, she stopped. She pulled a tissue from her coat pocket, an old one, clearly, a coat that had been worn for days, and blotted her eyes with the particular efficiency of someone who had been holding themselves together in public for a while. "Sorry," she said. "You don't need to be. It's been a week." "Yeah." He paused. "Do you have someone to call? To drive you home?" She looked at him with an expression that had a small, tired amount of dry humor in it. "I drove myself here." "Right." He glanced at the van in the lot. Of course she had. "I meant someone who knows where you are." A long beat. "Not really," she said. "Not anymore." She didn't explain it. She didn't need to. The coat, the reservoir, the alone at a closed park in November. Grant had enough context to understand, at least roughly, what not anymore meant. He didn't push. He didn't ask. People had the right to their own grief in the shape that fit them. "The wheel on your chair," he said. "The rim's bent. It'll roll, but it's going to pull right. You'll want to get it looked at." She tilted her head. Back to logistics. Ground level, manageable things. "Is there somewhere in Helena Ridge that does that?" "There's a medical equipment place on Franklin, over by the hospital. Guy named Torres. He's good. Fair." "Okay." She looked at the reservoir one more time, then turned her chair. "I should go." "Yeah." She paused. She seemed to weigh something, or maybe she was just tired, and then she said without looking back at him, "He's going to try to make that something it wasn't." Grant was quiet for a moment. "Let him try," he said. She nodded once. She wheeled toward the parking lot, Bishop watching her go until she was out of sight, his tail not moving, his expression, and Grant had always been a little unnerved by how clearly Bishop had expressions, troubled. Grant stood in the dark beside the reservoir for a while after the van's taillights had disappeared. He's going to try to make that something it wasn't. She hadn't been wrong to warn him. Grant knew the shape of that kind of thing. He'd dealt with men who operated inside institutional protections. Men who understood that their badge, their position, their access to official documentation was a form of armor that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with who got to write the report first. He'd seen it in the military, too. The difference was that in the military there were other people above and around who occasionally had the authority and the will to intervene. Out here in a small Idaho county, he wasn't sure what existed to check a deputy who had decided he had an enemy. He called Bishop to heel. They walked back through the dark to the truck. Price filed his report that night. Grant had expected that. What he hadn't fully anticipated was how quickly the language in it would escalate, from what should have been a trespassing encounter to a situation involving an erratic subject who resisted direction and a civilian witness who interfered with official duties and displayed threatening behavior toward a uniformed officer. He found this out 3 days later when a county deputy he'd never seen before knocked on the cabin door and asked if Grant Rourke was available to make a statement about an incident at Alder Creek Preserve on the evening of November 7th. Grant said yes. He sat at the kitchen table with the deputy, young, nervous, clearly not sure what he'd been sent to do. and gave an account of what he'd witnessed. Factual, sequential. The grab, the shove, the chair going over, Leah hitting the pavement. He offered to have it notarized if that would be helpful. The deputy wrote everything down and left looking slightly less sure of the assignment than when he'd arrived. That night, Grant called the number for the county sheriff's non-emergency line and asked politely who he should contact about a formal complaint regarding deputy conduct. He wrote down the name he was given and the address of the county administrative office. He didn't file anything yet. He was waiting. He'd learned, over a career that had included a significant amount of time in environments where moving too early was as fatal as moving too late, that patience was not the same as passivity. Patience was a tactical decision. Premature action burned information and gave the other party time to adapt. He had seen Leah's face when she'd said he's going to try to make that something it wasn't. He had heard the exhaustion and the knowledge in it. The voice of someone who understood exactly what the institutional weight of a badge meant in a situation where there were no witnesses and no recordings and only two people's accounts of what had happened in the dark. Two people's accounts. But there had been 3 at that reservoir. And the third one had 14 years of SEAL training, which included, among other things, a highly specific education in the tactical importance of documentation. Grant had already written his own account, dated, timed, detailed, within an hour of getting home that night. He'd emailed it to himself with a timestamp. He had the medical equipment store receipt he'd encouraged Leah to get when she took the chair in for repairs. He had the photograph he'd quietly taken of the damaged wheel rim. He had a statement ready. He was waiting to understand where to put it. On the 4th day after the incident, he went back to Alder Creek. Leah was there. She was at the same spot by the reservoir, but the charcoal coat was gone. She was wearing a dark blue fleece jacket and a gray scarf, and she looked not better exactly, but different, slightly less like someone who had stopped in the middle of moving. Bishop saw her first, and at 12 years old, moved with a speed that Grant hadn't seen from him in weeks. "Hey, Bishop!" She bent forward in the chair to greet him. "How are you, buddy?" Grant stopped a few feet back. "You came back." "I live 15 minutes from here." She straightened up. "And I liked it here before last week." A pause. "I wasn't going to let one bad night take the place from me." He understood that completely. They sat, or rather she sat, and he leaned against a nearby bench, watching the water in silence for a few minutes. It was a different silence than the one from the other night. Lighter. Not the silence of two people who didn't know each other, but the silence of two people who had been in something difficult together and come out the other side of it and now didn't need to fill the space. Eventually she said, "He filed a report." "I know, they came to take my statement." She looked at him. "What did you tell them?" "What I saw." A long beat. "Price has 8 years on the force," she said. "He's been there since the previous sheriff. People know him." "Does that change what happened?" "No, but it might change what gets done about it." She looked at the water, or whether anything does. Grant was quiet for a moment. "I have documentation," he said, "from that night, time-stamped." She turned to look at him. Something in her expression shifted, not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of someone who has been preparing for a fight alone and has just discovered they might not be as alone as they thought. "What kind of documentation?" "Written account from within an hour of the incident. Photos of your wheel rim. I'd suggest you hang on to any receipts from Torres at the equipment store." He paused. "And it might be worth talking to someone at the county DA's office about what the process looks like for a formal complaint against a deputy." She studied him. "You know a lot about this." "I know a lot about how institutions protect people inside them," he said, "and how you document things in a way that makes it harder to rewrite." She held his gaze for a moment. Then quietly, "Why are you doing this?" The question caught him slightly off guard. Not because it was unreasonable, it was completely reasonable, but because he hadn't, until she asked it, fully articulated the answer to himself. He thought about it honestly. The honest answer was not simple. Part of it was what he'd seen, and his fundamental inability to watch something that wrong happen to someone and do nothing about it. Part of it was Bishop, who had made his own decision about Leah within minutes, and whose judgment Grant had learned over 12 years to take seriously. And part of it, the part he was less comfortable examining, was that he was 6 months into an undefined existence in an unfamiliar town, carrying an injury and a history that he hadn't figured out what to do with, and standing up in that dark park had been the first time in those 6 months that the instincts he'd spent 14 years building had been pointed at something that mattered. He didn't say any of that. He said, "Because it was the right thing to do." She looked at him a moment longer, then she turned back to the water. "Okay," she said. Bishop settled at her feet, and the three of them sat beside the dark reservoir, and the wind moved through the bare cottonwoods, and somewhere behind them in the depths of the Helena Ridge County Sheriff's Department, a man named Price was writing things down, reframing things, polishing the story he intended to tell, and he had absolutely no idea what was already building against him. That night, Leah texted Grant the name of a disability rights attorney she'd found who took cases in Idaho on contingency. Grant looked at it. Then he looked at the ceiling of the cabin for a long time. Then he typed back, "Forward. Per your account of the incident, include the repair receipt." 3 minutes later, his phone buzzed. "Already did," she wrote. He almost smiled. Almost. Then Bishop made the sound he made when something was wrong. Not a bark, not a growl, something lower than both. And Grant was already moving to the window before he'd consciously decided to. The truck was parked in the gravel drive. A county cruiser was idling at the end of the road, lights off, engine on, just sitting there, watching. Grant stood at the window for a long time without moving. The cruiser didn't pull forward, didn't back up, just sat at the end of the gravel road with its engine running and its lights off, like something that had decided to make a point without committing to an action. The exhaust rose in a thin, pale column against the dark. Grant couldn't see the driver through the distance in the dark, but he didn't need to. He knew who it was the same way you knew certain things without confirmation. From pattern, from context, from the particular quality of a threat that had a face attached to it. Bishop was still making that low sound. Not a growl. Something older than a growl. Grant let the curtain fall back into place and stepped away from the window. He didn't turn the lights off. That would signal awareness, and he wasn't ready to signal anything yet. He walked to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, drank half of it standing at the sink. His shoulder ached in the cold the way it always did this time of year, a deep, specific ache that sat right at the edge of the repaired joint. Not quite pain, just the constant reminder of a thing that had been broken and put back together imperfectly. He set the glass down. He thought about what the cruiser meant. Not the legal dimension. Price wasn't going to do anything tonight, not with a complaint already in the system and an attorney's name now in Leah's contact list and a time-stamped written account sitting in Grant's email. Price was smarter than that, or at least experienced enough to know where the lines were. No, the cruiser wasn't a threat of action. It was a message. It was Price saying, "I know where you live, I know your truck, I know your dog's name, I know your routine, and I'm not done with you." Grant had received that message before. In different contexts, from different people, in several different countries. The content was always the same. The sender always believed it would accomplish something. It rarely did. He went back to the window 10 minutes later. The road was empty. The exhaust column was gone. The only sound was the wind in the pine trees and Bishop's breathing, which had settled back to normal. Grant sat down at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. He still used them, had used them his entire career for notes. He didn't want on any network device, and wrote down the time, the description of the vehicle, the duration of the observation, the direction of departure. He dated it. He noted it was the same deputy involved in the November 7th incident. He added it to the folder he'd started that night at the reservoir. Then he went to bed, because one of the things 14 years in the SEAL teams had built into him was the ability to sleep when sleep was available, regardless of what was in his head. You learned that, or you broke down. There was no third option. He slept. Bishop curled at the foot of the bed and did not make another sound. The next morning was clear and bitter, the kind of November morning in Idaho that looked beautiful from inside and punished you the moment you stepped through a door. Grant ran 3 miles on the road behind the cabin. Not fast, not slow, the shoulder dictating a pace that was more about maintenance than performance. Then came back and stood under a hot shower for longer than he usually allowed himself, because the cold had gotten into the joint and he needed the heat to loosen it. He made coffee. He fed Bishop. He sat at the table with the legal pad and thought about the situation the way he'd been trained to assess situations. Not emotionally, not reactively, but as a problem with components that needed to be identified and addressed in order of relevance. The components. as he saw them. One deputy with institutional protection and a personal grievance. One woman who had filed, or was in the process of filing, a formal complaint. One civilian witness, himself, whose account contradicted the official report. One damaged wheelchair documented by receipt and photograph. One attorney who had been contacted. One county administrative process that would either function as intended or demonstrate that it didn't. And one cruiser, idling outside his house in the dark. The cruiser was the variable that didn't fit the others. Everything else was legal, institutional, procedural. The cruiser was personal. The cruiser was Price operating outside the lines. Not far outside, not in any way that would be provable, but outside them. It was the kind of move a person made when they were starting to feel the walls of the official situation closing in, and they wanted to remind the people pressing the walls that there were other options available. Grant understood that kind of move. He also understood how it usually ended. He called Leah at 9 a.m. She picked up on the second ring, which told him she hadn't been sleeping either. "There was a county cruiser parked outside my cabin last night," he said. "Engine on, lights off. Sat there for about 10 minutes. A silence. "Price?" she said. "Most likely. He knows where you live. He ran my plates, probably. First night." He paused. "I documented it. Time, description, duration. It's in the file." Another silence, longer this time. He could hear her breathing, hear the sound of a chair moving on a hard floor. "Grant!" Her voice was level, but there was something under it. "I want to be honest with you. When this started, I didn't think about what it would mean for you. I was focused on my situation, and you got involved because you were there, and now he's—" She stopped. "You don't have to keep doing this. I know. I'm serious. If you want to walk away from it, Leah." He kept his voice even. "I wrote the statement because it was accurate. I documented the cruiser because it's relevant. I'm not doing anything that isn't just describing what happened." A pause. "I'm not walking away from an accurate account of events." A longer silence. "Okay," she said. "Is the attorney moving?" "She called yesterday. She wants to meet next week. She said the documentation I sent her was—" She used the word thorough. A beat, dry. "I sent her yours too. Hope that's all right." "That's exactly right." She also said— Leah paused. "She said that this kind of thing usually depends on whether it's an isolated incident or a pattern. She's going to pull his record. Complaints, disciplinary notes, anything in the public file." Grant was quiet for a moment. "Let me know what she finds," he said. "I will." Then, "How's your shoulder in this cold?" The question caught him off guard. Not because it was intrusive, it wasn't, but because it was the kind of question that required him to have said something at some point that made it askable. He'd mentioned the injury, he realized. He couldn't remember when. Maybe the night at the reservoir. Things had been said that he hadn't fully tracked because other things were happening. "Manageable," he said. "That's a SEAL answer." He paused. "What does that mean?" "It means you're not going to admit it hurts." He didn't respond to that. She had, he noted, correctly identified what he'd said and what it actually meant, which was a thing he wasn't entirely used to. "I'll be in touch," he said. "Yeah. Hey, Grant?" "Yeah." "Be careful." He hung up and sat with the phone on the table for a moment. Bishop watched him from across the room with the patient, slightly judgmental expression of a dog who had formed opinions. "Don't," Grant told him. Bishop put his head down on his paws. "I went to Alder Creek that afternoon. Not because he'd planned to, he hadn't, but because his body made the decision before his conscious mind weighed in, and he'd long since learned to pay attention to that kind of involuntary navigation. He parked in the lot, clipped Bishop's leash, and walked the trail in the thin afternoon light, the gravel frozen hard underfoot, the reservoir catching the pale sky and throwing it back. He walked the section where it had happened. He stood there for a moment. The ground was still scuffed where the chair had gone over, the frozen gravel displaced in a pattern that, if you knew what you were looking at, told the story clearly. He photographed it, though he doubted it would survive the next freeze-thaw cycle with enough detail to be useful. He noted the exact distance from the parking lot entrance. He noted the position relative to the nearest trail light, which was 40 feet away and had been off that night because the preserve's lights ran on a timer that cut at closing. Nobody had seen it except him. Nobody had heard it except him. And Bishop. He crouched down beside the scuffed gravel and thought about the attorney, about the complaint process, about what Leah had said. Usually depends on whether it's an isolated incident or a pattern. The thing was, and Grant had not been here long enough to know this from personal experience, but he'd learned to read towns in the way that people who spent a lot of time in unfamiliar environments learned to read them. Small departments in small counties developed cultures. Those cultures were usually shaped by whoever had been there the longest and had the most informal authority. Not always the highest rank. Sometimes just the person who'd been present through enough shifts, enough incidents, enough years, that their interpretation of what was acceptable had become the department's interpretation. 8 years was a long time. Grant pulled out his phone and looked up the Helena Ridge County Sheriff's Department, public records. He was looking for the complaint line, the administrative oversight process, the name of whoever handled internal affairs. There was no internal affairs unit, too small a department. Complaints went to the sheriff directly. He looked up the current sheriff. Elected position. Had been in office 11 years. His campaign page, still live from the last election cycle, had a photo of him shaking hands with several deputies. One of them was Price. Grant put his phone away. Bishop was watching a pair of ducks cross the far end of the reservoir with the look of an animal who had been retired from active duty and was making his peace with it. "What do you think?" Grant asked him. Bishop did not answer. "Yeah," Grant said. "Me neither." Well, 4 days later, the attorney called Leah. Leah called Grant at 7:45 in the evening, and he could hear something different in her voice immediately. Not excitement, not relief, but the particular quality of controlled anger that comes when something you suspected is confirmed, and the confirmation is worse than you'd hoped for. "She pulled his complaint history," Leah said. "You have a minute? Go." 3 formal complaints in 8 years. All 3 were dismissed at the department level, never escalated. She's pulling the original documentation, whatever's in the public file. But she said the dismissal language in 2 of them is nearly identical, which usually means someone was using a template, which means someone was making a practice of dismissing things fast without individual review. Grant was at the kitchen table. He picked up his pen. What were the complaints? 1 excessive force, roadside stop, 2019. Guy said Price pulled him out of the car and had him on the ground before he'd even come to a complete stop. Price's report said the subject was reaching for something. Complaint dismissed. Insufficient evidence. A pause. Second one was 2021. A woman, native, filed a complaint that Price had followed her for 6 blocks after a traffic stop and then approached her at her home an hour later. He said he had additional questions about the stop. She said it was intimidation. Dismissed. Officer judgment within scope of duties. Another pause. Third one, last year. That's the one his supervisor mentioned. The October stop. I don't have the details yet, but she said the language in the report is, she used the word carefully written, like someone who knew how to construct a narrative. Grant was writing. So there's a pattern, he said. There's something, whether it's enough. Leah stopped. She said the key is going to be whether any of those complainants will come forward. If it's just me and your witness account, it's 1 incident. If there are 3 others who'll say the same thing, then it's a practice. Yes. A beat. She also said, Leah's voice shifted, dropped slightly. She said these things are hard. She wanted me to know that going in, that even with documentation, even with witnesses, departments protect their own, and county politics are what they are, and sometimes what should happen doesn't happen. A long pause. She said she'd take the case. She also said I should prepare for it to be ugly. Grant looked at his legal pad. 5 pages now. Dates, times, observations. What are you going to do? He asked. The pause before her answer was long enough that he could hear Bishop shift position in the other room. I'm going to do it, Leah said. I was sitting by a reservoir minding my own business. I wasn't doing anything wrong. He threw me out of my chair. Her voice was level, flat. I'm going to do it. Okay. Will you? She stopped, started again. If it goes forward, if they need your statement officially, on record, attached to a formal complaint, will you do that? He didn't hesitate. Yes. A silence that had a texture to it, something like relief mixed with the weight of what relief meant here. Not that things were going to be easy, but that at least she wasn't carrying it alone. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. I was there. I saw it." He paused. "This is just accurate." She made a small sound that might have been a laugh or something close to it. "You say that a lot." "It keeps being true." She said goodnight. He hung up. He sat with the legal pad and thought about patterns and documentation and the particular durability of institutional corruption when it was small enough to be informal, not organized, not conspiratorial, just the accumulation of small decisions by small people who had learned that certain things went away if you filled the forms out correctly. He added a note to the bottom of the page. The 3 prior complainants, names he didn't have yet. People who had believed nobody would listen. He had believed that about enough things in his life to understand what it felt like. 2 weeks passed. They developed, without either of them formally deciding to, a routine. Alder Creek, Tuesday and Thursday evenings, sometimes Saturday morning if the weather was decent. Not long visits, an hour, usually. Sometimes less. They walked the trail, or rather Leah rolled it, and Grant walked beside her, and Bishop moved between them in the comfortable democratic way of dogs who had adopted more than one person. She talked about Claire sometimes, not in the way people talked about loss when they were performing grief for someone else's comfort, but in the fragmented, non-linear way that real grief worked. A thing Claire had said once, a habit she'd had, something that had happened between them years ago that Leah found herself thinking about for no apparent reason. Grant listened. He was, it turned out, a better listener than he was a talker, which was not a surprise to him but seemed to be a mild surprise to her. She asked him, eventually, about the shoulder. Not what happened, she didn't ask what happened, but what it felt like now. How he'd adjusted. He answered more than he expected to, which was another mild surprise. "Does it affect what you can do?" she asked. "Some things. Nothing I want to talk about from a career standpoint." A pause. "I can still run, hike. I can't do some of the overhead lifts I used to do. Can't take a hit on the right side the way I could." He was quiet for a moment. "Some days I don't notice it. Some days it's all I notice." She nodded. She understood that arithmetic in a way that most people he knew didn't. "The chair is like that," she said. "Some days I forget it's part of how the world sees me. Some days someone walks up and talks to whoever I'm with instead of to me, and I remember again." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Price talked at you like you weren't a person. Price talked at me like I was an inconvenience in a shape he didn't respect." A pause. "That's not new. He just took it further than most." They sat with that for a moment, the reservoir gray and still in the thin November light. "My sister used to say—" Leah stopped, started again. "She used to say that the chair didn't change who I was. And she was right. But she didn't always understand that the chair changes how the world comes at you, and that you have to develop a whole separate set of skills just to navigate that gap, and those skills are exhausting." She looked at the water. She was trying to help. She didn't always get it exactly right. She still showed up. Grant thought about that. "That's more than most people," he said. "Yeah." She pulled her jacket tighter. "It really is." On a Thursday evening in late November, 17 days after the incident at the reservoir, they returned to the preserve to find a printed notice taped to the preserve entrance gate. It was a restriction order. Specifically, it was a notice that Leah Carver was, pending investigation of a trespassing incident on November 7th, barred from entering Alder Creek Preserve under threat of citation. Grant read it twice. Leah read it once, and he watched her face do something very controlled and very quiet. A compression around the jaw, the eyes going still. "He can do that?" Grant asked. "Apparently someone thinks he can." She pulled out her phone and photographed the notice. "Or someone did him a favor and thinks this will scare me off." "Does it?" She lowered the phone and looked at him. "What do you think?" she said. Grant looked at the notice. He looked at the date on it, issued 2 days ago, which was the same day the attorney had sent a formal letter to the county administrator's office, requesting Price's complete disciplinary record. That was not a coincidence. He photographed the notice himself. He noted the issuing authority, not the sheriff, not any named official, but a general county parks administration stamp that could have been placed by anyone with access to the right forms. Leah had already texted her attorney. The response came back in 4 minutes. "Screenshot and preserve original. This may constitute retaliation. "Do not enter the preserve. We will move on it tomorrow." Leah read it aloud. Then she put her phone in her jacket pocket and looked at the trail beyond the gate, the path she'd been coming to for 2 years, that led to the reservoir, to the exact spot where she'd watched the water on the worst nights, and remembered that the world was still large and still had room for her in it. Bishop sat beside her and looked at the gate with the expression of an old dog encountering an unreasonable obstacle. "Come on," Grant said. "I know another trail. Different preserve, 12 minutes east, no gate." She looked at him. "The reservoir's nicer," she said. "Yeah, but the other one has a better view of the ridge." A pause. Then she turned her chair. They went back to the trucks and drove east, and the gate and the notice and the name Price sat behind them in the cold November dark. And ahead of them, the sky was doing something with the last of the light that made the ridge look like the edge of something worth seeing, and Bishop rode in the back of Grant's truck with his head out the window in defiance of the temperature, because he was 12 years old and had earned the right to make his own decisions. Neither Grant nor Leah spoke much on the drive. But at one point, at a red light in the center of Helena Ridge, Leah's van pulled alongside Grant's truck, and she rolled down her window, and he rolled down his. "The attorney found one of the other complainants," she said, "the woman from 2021. She wants to talk." The light changed. Grant nodded. They drove. And in the county sheriff's office on the far side of town, a file with Price's name on it was sitting on a desk that had not previously paid it much attention, but was about to. The woman from 2021 was named Sandra Running Water, and she lived in a pale green house on the eastern edge of Helena Ridge with 2 dogs, a broken porch step that nobody had gotten around to fixing, and the particular wariness of someone who had once tried to make something official and had been made to regret it. Leah called Grant the morning after the drive east and told him Sandra had agreed to meet with the attorney the following Tuesday. Then she said carefully that Sandra had asked whether the civilian witness, Grant, would be present. Not in an official capacity, just present. "She wants to know what kind of person you are before she says anything on record," Leah said. "That's reasonable. She's been through something, more than what's in the complaint file." "I'll be there." The meeting was at the attorney's office, a second-floor suite above a tax preparation business on Main Street that smelled like old carpet and printer ink. The attorney's name was Ruth Calloway, and she was somewhere in her mid-50s, gray-haired, with the deliberate economy of movement that came from spending decades in rooms where every gesture was being read. She shook Grant's hand without particular ceremony and looked at him the way people looked at him when they were deciding whether he was going to be an asset or a complication. Sandra Running Water was 44, compact, with the kind of stillness that came from having learned, at some point in her life, that being noticed could cost you. She sat with her hands folded on the table and her eyes moving between the people in the room, and she did not relax when she saw Grant, but she did not leave either, which he took as enough. Ruth opened the meeting by explaining what the process looked like from this point. A formal complaint had been filed by Leah with the county administrator. The administrator's office had forwarded it to the state attorney general's office for review, which was a step that could happen when a county department lacked independent oversight structures, or when someone in the administrator's office was paying attention and understood that forwarding it was the right call. "That's unusual," Leah said. "It's not common," Ruth said, "but it's not unprecedented, and it's better for us than having it sit in the sheriff's inbox." Sandra had been watching Ruth speak. Now she looked at Leah. "You actually got them to move it up?" "The documentation helped," Ruth said. 2 time-stamped accounts, repair records, photographic evidence of the chair damage, the restriction notice, which, incidentally, the administrator's office has already flagged as procedurally irregular. Sandra looked at Grant. "You wrote one of the accounts." "Yes." "You saw the whole thing?" "From about 50 yards. I had a clear sight line." She studied him for a moment in the particular way of someone who had presented evidence before and had been told it wasn't sufficient and was now deciding whether this time was going to be different. "What did you do before you came here?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Military." "What kind?" "Navy." A pause. "What kind of Navy?" Grant met her eyes. "The kind where what I say about what I witnessed carries a particular weight in a formal proceeding, and the kind where I understand chain of command and documentation and how to construct an account that doesn't fall apart under cross-examination." He paused. "I'm not here to impress you, Ms. Running Water. I'm here because you asked if I'd be present. I was at the reservoir. I saw what I saw. And I'm going to say exactly that, on record, for as long as it takes. Sandra looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at Ruth. Okay, she said. Here's what happened to me in 2021. She talked for 40 minutes without stopping. What was in the public complaint file was a skeleton. What Sandra described was different in degree and texture, and in the particular specific detail of something that had happened to a real person, rather than been summarized into bureaucratic language designed to minimize it. Price had stopped her for a broken taillight on a Tuesday evening in September. The stop had taken 22 minutes. In those 22 minutes, he had asked her the same questions 3 separate times in different sequences. Where was she going? Where had she been? Who did she know in that neighborhood? In the way that police sometimes did when they were trying to catch inconsistencies, or when they simply wanted to make the exercise of moving through the world feel like something that required their permission. She had been polite. She had answered. She had a broken taillight. She acknowledged that. She'd expected a fix-it ticket in 5 minutes and to be on her way. Instead, he'd asked her to step out of the car. She'd asked why. He'd said he needed to run her plates more thoroughly, and it was procedure to have her out of the vehicle. It was not procedure. She'd stepped out because she was alone on a road at dusk with a man who had a gun and a badge, and she'd done the calculation that every woman alone on a road at dusk with a man who had a gun and a badge eventually did. He'd run her plates. Clean. He'd walked around her car slowly, looking at things. He'd asked her if there was anything in the vehicle she wanted to tell him about. She'd said no. He'd asked again, differently. She'd said no again. He'd handed her the fix-it ticket and told her to have a nice evening. She'd driven home. Her hands had shaken on the wheel for 10 minutes. She'd sat in her driveway for another 5 before she could go inside. An hour later, a county cruiser had pulled up outside her house. Price had knocked on her door. He told her he had a follow-up question about the stop. She'd opened the door because she was in her house, and she'd actually thought, at that moment, that she was safe. The follow-up question was whether she knew a man named Darren Whitehorse, who lived 4 blocks away and had a prior arrest for possession. She did not know Darren Whitehorse. Price had nodded slowly, had told her that the neighborhood had been having some issues, and he'd just like to know who the residents were and what they were about. Had smiled. She described the smile in a way that made Ruth stop writing for a second and look up, and told her she had a nice house and to get that taillight fixed. He'd left. She'd filed the complaint the next day. It had been dismissed within a week. Insufficient basis. Officer conducting routine community relations. Community relations, Sandra said, and her voice was flat in a way that said everything. Ruth was writing. Leah's hands were still in her lap, and her face had the expression Grant was coming to recognize. The one where the anger was real and was being held in a very specific container because letting it out in the wrong direction didn't help anything. Grant had not moved during Sandra's account. He'd sat with his forearms on the table and his eyes on her, and he'd listened the way he'd been trained to listen during intelligence briefings, not waiting for a turn to speak, not organizing a response, just taking in everything and cataloging it. The follow-up visit to your home, he said, when she finished. Did he ever use the word investigation or inquiry, or give any official framing for why he was there? Sandra shook her head. He called it a follow-up question. That's it. Did anyone else know he was there? My neighbor saw his car. I didn't think to ask her to write anything down. Is she still your neighbor? Sandra blinked. Yes. If she's willing, Ruth said, picking up the thread, a statement from her establishing that a county vehicle was at your residence that evening could be useful corroboration. It's been 3 years, but she may remember. Sandra thought about it. She's got a good memory. She doesn't like police much, which means she probably logged it. I'll need her contact information. There was more. Ruth went through it methodically. Dates, what Sandra still had in writing, whether she'd told anyone at the time, whether there was any correspondence. Sandra had kept the original fix-it ticket. She had a screenshot of the complaint confirmation email. She had a text she'd sent her cousin the night Price showed up at the house, describing what had happened, which was time-stamped 8:47 p.m. on the night in question. A text sent to a family member describing an event at the moment it occurred was not nothing. It was not a formal record, but it was contemporaneous and it was human, and juries understood texts sent to cousins in a way they sometimes didn't understand formal documents. Ruth understood this. Grant could see it in the way she noted the text carefully and underlined something twice. By the time they finished, it was past noon. Sandra accepted a cup of coffee from the small machine in Ruth's break room and held it with both hands and looked at Leah. "I almost didn't come," she said. "I know," Leah said. I went through the process once. I know what it cost me, not in money, She stopped, in believing that it was worth doing. Leah was quiet for a moment. "I can't promise it'll go the way it should," she said. "Ruth's already told me that." "I know." Sandra looked at her coffee. "But you've got documentation I didn't have, and you've got him." She tilted her head toward Grant without looking at him. "Whatever he is." Grant said nothing. "I'm in," Sandra said. The state attorney general's office moved faster than Ruth had expected. By the first week of December, 2 investigators had driven up from Boise and were sitting in the county administrator's conference room asking questions that the administrator, a cautious, middle-aged man named Holt, who had clearly been hoping this would go away, was now obligated to answer under the official weight of a state inquiry. Ruth told Leah about this on a Thursday. Leah told Grant that evening at the Eastern Preserve, the one with the view of the ridge, where they'd been coming since the restriction notice had closed Alder Creek to her. The light was doing what December light did in Idaho, coming in low and flat and orange, the kind of light that made everything look like the last day of something. Bishop walked ahead of them on the trail with the deliberate pace of a dog who was no longer interested in hurrying anywhere but still wanted to be the one deciding the route. "Holt is cooperating," Leah said. "Ruth thinks he's been uncomfortable with Price for a while, and this is his exit ramp." "Smart," Grant said. "He sees which way it's going." 2 other complaints have surfaced since the inquiry was announced. People who hadn't filed officially but had told someone, who told someone else. She paused. "One of them is from 2018, before the ones in the file." Grant looked at the trail ahead. "So it goes back further." "Apparently." Her voice had a quality in it he'd heard before. Not satisfaction, because what had been done to those people wasn't satisfying to learn about, but the particular feeling of a pattern becoming undeniable, of a truth that had always been there beginning to take up the space it was owed. Ruth says the state investigators specifically asked about the complaint dismissal process, whether they all went through the same channel, whether there was a single person who'd been signing off on them. Was there? She doesn't know yet, but she said the fact that they're asking means they already think the answer is yes. Grant thought about the sheriff's campaign photo, the hand on the deputy's shoulder, 11 years in office. "Price might not be the only person with a problem," he said. Leah looked at him. No, he might not. They walked, rolled and walked, in silence for a while. The orange light was going purple at the edges now, the ridge turning black against the sky. "How are you doing with all of it?" he asked. She was quiet for long enough that he wondered if she hadn't heard him. Then, "I have days where I'm absolutely certain this is the right thing to do. And I have days where I come home and I sit there and I think about Claire and I think about the chair and I think about that night, and I'm just tired." A pause. "I don't say that so you'll reassure me. I'm telling you because you asked." "I know." "I'm going to keep doing it," she said. "I'm just tired." "Tired's fine," he said. "Tired means you're actually in it." She glanced at him sideways. "Is that Navy wisdom?" "It's just true." The path curved toward the ridge view, a clearing in the trees where the whole eastern face opened up, and you could see the mountains in whatever light was left. Bishop stopped there the way he always stopped there, as if he'd personally selected the spot and was checking whether it still met his standards. Leah stopped beside him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The mountains were there. The light was almost gone. The cold was the clean, honest kind of cold that didn't apologize for itself. "My sister would have liked you," Leah said. Grant didn't answer right away. He thought about what that meant. Not the compliment in it, but the past tense, the specific weight of it. "She sounds like she had good judgment," he said. Leah made the sound that was close to a laugh. "She really did. Look." 12 days later, Nolan Price came without his badge. It was a Tuesday evening, which was their usual Alder Creek night, except Alder Creek was still officially restricted for Leah, so they'd switched to the Eastern Preserve by habit, arriving separately, meeting at the trailhead, walking the same path toward the ridge view. Grant got there first. He parked, let Bishop out, and was standing at the trailhead checking his phone. Ruth had sent a message that afternoon about a scheduled interview with the state investigators the following week, when Bishop stopped. Completely stopped. Not the slow stop of an old dog finding a smell. The hard stop. Ears forward, body rigid, the specific posture that meant something in Bishop's operational vocabulary that Grant had learned to read the way he read instrument panels. Grant put his phone in his pocket. He looked at the tree line. A man stepped out from the bare cottonwoods along the edge of the lot, and even at 60 feet and in the failing light of 4:45 on a December afternoon, Grant recognized the build and the walk before he could see the face. Price was out of uniform, dark jacket, jeans, work boots. No cruiser this time. He'd parked somewhere else, which meant he'd thought about this before coming. He'd thought about this. Grant's assessment shifted in the half-second it took him to process that detail. A uniformed Price at the trailhead was one kind of problem, contained by the constraints of being in uniform, on the record, technically accountable. An out-of-uniform Price who'd parked somewhere nobody would see his vehicle was a different kind of problem entirely. He didn't reach for his phone. Not yet. He stood where he was and watched Price close the distance, and he adjusted his stance by about 3 degrees, feet slightly wider, weight redistributed, the right shoulder rolled back by a fraction. Nothing that would read as aggressive to an observer, but everything that mattered in terms of what he was ready to do. Bishop didn't move. His growl was completely silent, vibrating only in his chest. Price stopped 15 feet away. "You know what you cost me," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was low, and it had something in it that was past anger. Anger had heat, and this was colder than that. This was a man who had spent weeks converting rage into intention. Grant looked at him. "You're going to want to be careful right now," Grant said. His voice was the same voice he'd used at the reservoir. Quiet, factual. "About what you say and what you do. You came into something that wasn't your business." A woman was on the ground. "You don't know what you walked into." "I know exactly what I walked into," Grant said. "I documented it within the hour. My statement is with the State Attorney General's office. Your complaint history is under review, so I'm going to say this once. Whatever you came here to do, don't." Price's jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes, not a calculation, because this wasn't a calculated man in this moment. This was a man who had decided somewhere on the drive here that certain outcomes were worth certain risks, and that decision was now sitting in the middle of his face where Grant could read it clearly. "My career is gone," Price said. "You understand that? 8 years. "I didn't end your career," Grant said. "You ended your career. At a reservoir. On November 7th. The silence between them was the kind that had weight. Price moved. He didn't announce it. No more words, no wind-up, no telegraphing. Just a sudden closing of the distance and a right hand swinging from the outside, and Grant was already moving because he'd been watching Price's shoulder, not his face, because shoulders told you what was coming 3/10 of a second before it arrived, and 3/10 of a second was everything. He stepped left and slightly inside, taking himself off the line of the punch, and redirected Price's arm outward with both hands. Not catching it, not blocking it, redirecting it, using the momentum, which was a very specific distinction. Price lurched forward with his own force. Grant stepped behind him and put a hand on the back of his collar and let Price's own motion carry him into a stumble against the parking lot barrier post at the edge of the trailhead. The whole thing took about a second and a half. Price caught himself on the post. He turned around. His face had gone through something, surprise, disbelief, a rapid recalibration. He came again. This time a left hand, lower, going for the body. Grant turned his hip into it, caught the wrist, applied pressure to the elbow joint in the direction it wasn't designed to bend, and walked Price backward 2 steps until his back hit the barrier post again. "Stop," Grant said. He was breathing normally. His shoulder ached in the specific way it ached when he put load through it, and he noted that distantly and filed it away for later. He had Price's left arm controlled at the elbow. He was not squeezing. He was simply holding the joint at the angle where forward pressure from Price would hurt considerably more than compliance. Price breathed hard through his nose. "Let go of me, when you're done. I will have you arrested for defending myself on a public trail when you arrived out of uniform and initiated contact." Grant kept his voice completely flat. "I'd be careful about how that report reads." Something in Price's body changed. Not surrender, not quite, but the specific physical response of a man who has just run into a wall he didn't know was there and needs a moment to understand what he's hit. Grant had felt that response before, in training, in the field, in rooms where the person across from him suddenly understood that the situation was not what they thought it was. He released Price's arm and stepped back. 2 full steps, clear space, non-threatening posture, relatively speaking. Bishop had not moved, had not barked, was still standing in that complete stillness, watching. Price rubbed his elbow. He looked at Grant with something that was not quite rage anymore. Rage had somewhere to go. This was the expression of a man standing at the edge of a thing he'd already stepped off of and was only now looking down. "Who are you?" he said. Not a challenge, almost a genuine question. Grant didn't answer. Price straightened. He looked at Bishop. He looked at Grant. He made a small sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else entirely, and then he turned and walked back toward the tree line, in the direction he'd come from, and the bare branches closed behind him, and the parking lot was empty and quiet again. Grant stood still for a moment. His shoulder was talking to him fairly loudly now. He rotated it once, carefully, checking the range of motion. Still functional. He'd pay for the rotation tonight, but that was manageable. He heard tires on gravel on the far side of the tree line. One vehicle, moving away. He pulled out his phone and called Ruth Calloway. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Something happened," he said. "I need to tell you exactly what it was." I was still on the phone when Leah's van pulled into the lot. She got out, ramp deploying, chair unfolding, the practice sequence, and read his face before he could say anything. "What happened?" He held up one finger, still on with Ruth. Ruth was asking clarifying questions, and he was answering them in the same sequence and detail he'd have used for any official debrief. Time, location, initiating party, number of contacts, duration, outcome, witness status. "Any witnesses?" Ruth asked. "Negative at the moment. My dog." A pause. "No people." "Any injuries, yours or his?" "None on my end. His elbow's going to be uncomfortable, but he walked out of here on his own." "Okay, I need you to write this down within the hour and send it to me with a timestamp. Same format as the reservoir account." "Already planning to." "Grant." Ruth's voice shifted slightly, losing the attorney cadence for just a second. "What did he think was going to happen?" He looked at the empty tree line. "I don't think he was thinking," he said. "I think he'd stopped doing that." He hung up. Leah was watching him. The chair was still, her hands in her lap. "Tell me," she said. He told her. All of it, in the same sequence, no dramatizing, no editorializing, just the facts in the order they'd happened. She listened without interrupting. Her face went through several things, none of them simple. When he finished, there was a silence. "He attacked you," she said. "He swung at me twice. I redirected him twice. He left." "That's an attack, Grant." "Yes." She looked at the tree line. Her jaw was set. "This is going to the investigators." Ruth's already flagging it. It potentially constitutes witness intimidation, attempted assault, conduct unbecoming, several things, depending on how the state investigates it. "And you're okay?" "Shoulders annoyed at me. I'm fine." She looked at him for a long moment. The light was almost completely gone now, the parking lot in the gray-blue of just after sunset, the ridge a dark line against a darkening sky. "He came out here without his badge," she said, "without his car, without anyone knowing where he was." "Yes. That's—" She stopped. "That's a man who knows it's falling apart and has decided to make it personal instead." "That's my read, yes." She looked at her hands, then up at him. Something in her expression had shifted from the controlled anger he knew to something more stripped down, something that was just clear and direct and didn't have anything extra in it. What did he look like when he left? Grant thought about it. Like someone who'd just found out the story he'd been telling himself wasn't true, he said. Leah nodded slowly. Bishop walked to her and put his head against her knee, and she put her hand on his gray muzzle and held it there, and the three of them stayed in the parking lot in the failing December light without speaking for a while. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that mattered had already happened, and some things you just needed to stand inside of for a moment before you moved on. The wind came through the cottonwoods. The The ridge was dark, and somewhere on the other side of Helena Ridge, in an office that had recently received a very specific set of documents from the State Attorney General's investigative division, someone was sitting across from Nolan Price with a folder on the table and a question that had been a long time coming. The investigator's name was Carla Deming, and she drove up from Boise in a gray state-issue sedan that she parked in front of the county administrator's building at 7:58 on a Wednesday morning, 2 days after Price had walked out of the tree line at the Eastern Preserve and swung at a man he didn't know well enough to be swinging at. She was 49, short, with the kind of face that people consistently underestimated in the first 5 minutes of a meeting and then spent the rest of the meeting revising their estimate of. She wore a dark blazer over a plain shirt and carried a leather portfolio that looked like it had been through a significant number of difficult rooms. She had a partner, younger, male, named Rice, who carried the secondary files and said very little, which Grant eventually understood was a deliberate division of labor. Deming asked the questions. Reese watched the room. Grant had been asked to come in at 9. He arrived at 8:55, which was a habit he'd never managed to break. Early was on time. On time was late. He sat in the waiting area with a paper cup of bad coffee and his legal pad, which had 11 pages now, and read back through his notes the way he'd have reviewed a mission brief before a debrief. Not memorizing, just orienting, making sure he knew where everything was. Ruth Calloway arrived at 8:58. She sat beside him, set her own portfolio on her knees, and looked at the cup of coffee. Is that from the machine in the hall? Yes. Don't drink that. He put it down. They're going to ask you about the parking lot incident first, she said quietly. That's the most recent. They'll want the reservoir account second. They may ask about your background. Be factual. Don't editorialize. I know how to give a debrief. This isn't a debrief. It's an investigative interview, and there are legal dimensions. Ruth. He looked at her calmly. I know how to do this. She studied him for a moment. Then she nodded and opened her portfolio. At 9:02, a woman in a blazer appeared in the doorway and told them Investigator Deming was ready. The room was a conference room borrowed from the county administrator. Laminate table, 6 chairs, a whiteboard with old marker residue nobody had fully erased, a window that looked out at a parking lot. Deming was already seated. Rice stood near the wall with a legal pad. There was a digital recorder on the table, a small one, and Deming touched it once to confirm it was running before anyone sat down. Mr. Rourke, she said, thank you for coming in. Sure. Before we start, for the record, you're here voluntarily, you're not under any investigation, and you're represented by counsel. She glanced at Ruth. Ms. Calloway? Investigator. Deming looked back at Grant. Can you walk me through the events of December 9th at the eastern branch of the Bitterroot Preserve? Start from when you arrived in the parking lot. He walked her through it. He used the same language and sequence as the written account he'd sent Ruth. Not because he was reciting it, but because what had happened in a specific order, and that order was the clearest way to convey it. Arrived at 4:21, parked. Exited vehicle with Bishop, standing at trailhead, checking phone. Bishop alerted at 4:33. Subject emerged from tree line approximately 60 feet distant. Grant identified the subject as Deputy Nolan Price based on prior visual familiarity from the November 7th incident. Subject approached on foot, out of uniform, no visible badge, no county vehicle in lot. Verbal exchange occurred. Subject initiated physical contact at 4:38. 2 attempts. Both redirected. Subject departed on foot into tree line at 4:41. Sound of a vehicle departing from north side of the tree line approximately 2 minutes later. Deming had been writing during all of this. She didn't interrupt. When he stopped, she looked at what she'd written and then looked up. When you say redirected, she said, what does that mean exactly? He swung. I moved. His momentum took him into the barrier post. Second time, I controlled his left arm at the elbow joint and walked him backward. He stopped. I released him. Did you strike him at any point? No. Did he sustain any injury that you observed? He rubbed his elbow when I released him. He walked out without assistance. And your own injuries? My right shoulder has a prior surgical repair. Loading it the way I did last night will have aggravated it. Nothing acute. Deming looked at him. You said you have a prior surgical repair on the shoulder. Can you tell me more about that? Ruth shifted slightly beside him. The question was within scope, but it was also the question that opened the door to the background discussion, and Grant understood that Deming had arrived at it deliberately. She'd waited for the factual account to be complete before she went looking for context. Training accident, Grant said. January of last year. I was active duty Navy at the time. What was your rate and classification at time of separation? E8, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Naval Special Warfare Command. A brief pause. Deming's pen moved. You were a SEAL, she said. Yes. Ice, near the wall, wrote something on his pad without looking up. How long in Naval Special Warfare? 9 years assigned to Nice Bars, 14 years total service. When did you separate? 8 months ago. And you relocated to Helena Ridge? 6 months ago, approximately. Deming set her pen down on the table. It was a deliberate gesture, putting the writing instrument down, creating a different quality of attention. Mr. Rourke, I want to ask you something that's slightly outside the formal scope of this interview, and I want to be clear that you don't have to answer it, but it would help me understand the picture. He waited. Why did you intervene at the reservoir on November 7th? You had no formal obligation. You didn't know Ms. Carver. Most people in that situation would have called it in and stayed back. Grant looked at the table for a moment, not avoiding the question, thinking about how to answer it accurately. I heard the impact, he said. I looked, and I saw a woman on the ground, and a man with a badge standing over her. The sequence of what I'd observed before that, the grab, the chair going over, was clear enough that I knew what had happened. A pause. I have a particular aversion to walking away from something like that. Because of your training? Because of my nature, he said. The training made me more useful in the moment. It didn't create the instinct. Deming was quiet for a second. Then she picked her pen back up. The documentation you've compiled, she said. The time-stamped accounts, the photographs, the supplementary notes. That's not what most civilian witnesses produce. No, I imagine not. It's what someone produces who understands how evidence works in a formal proceeding. Yes. Did you intend from the beginning to build a case? I intended from the beginning to have an accurate record, he said. I've spent a lot of time in environments where what actually happened mattered very much, and where people with authority over the narrative had reasons to prefer a different version. I learned to document. Deming looked at him for a moment with an expression that he couldn't fully read, something between professional assessment and something more personal, like recognition. Okay, she said. She turned a page in her portfolio. Let's talk about November 7th. The interview ran 2 hours and 20 minutes. Ruth intervened twice, once when Rice asked a question about whether Grant had any prior contact with the Helena Ridge Sheriff's Department that Ruth correctly identified as outside the scope and potentially phishing, and once when Deming asked Grant to characterize Price's emotional state during the parking lot encounter, which was opinion testimony rather than factual observation. He can describe what he observed, Ruth said. Behavioral indicators, not characterization. Fair, Deming said, without friction. Grant described the behavioral indicators. Price's jaw. The quality of stillness that preceded the first swing. The way he'd rubbed his elbow afterward. The sound he'd made when he turned to leave, but that ambiguous sound, not quite a laugh, not quite anything else. When it was over, Deming clicked off the recorder and leaned back in her chair. Off record, she said. You understand I can't tell you where the investigation is. I know. But I can tell you that what you've given us today, combined with the prior documentation, is substantially useful. She paused. The parking lot incident, that's its own category. That's not a he said situation. That's a former deputy who drove to a location where he knew a witness would be and initiated physical contact. Former, Grant said. Deming looked at him. As of yesterday afternoon, Price has been placed on administrative suspension pending completion of this investigation. Ruth made a small controlled sound that was the attorney equivalent of a significant exhale. The suspension is without pay? She asked. I can't confirm the terms. Ruth nodded in a way that said she'd take the non-answer as a yes. Grant picked up his legal pad. He held it for a moment, looking at the 11 pages. The other complainants, he said, Sandra Running Water, the ones from 2018 and last year. They're being interviewed? Everyone relevant is being interviewed. And the sheriff? A pause. Everyone relevant, Deming said again. He stood. Ruth stood. They shook hands with Deming and Rice. In the hallway, waiting for the elevator, Ruth turned to him with her portfolio under her arm and said quietly, "You know what everyone relevant means in that context. It means the complaint dismissal process is under review. It means someone above Price may be answering questions they thought they'd never have to answer." The elevator came. They stepped in. "How's Leah?" Ruth asked. "She's steady," Grant said. "She's angry. Those aren't the same thing." "No," Ruth said. "They're not." Leah's meeting with Deming was the following day, and she went alone. She'd told Grant the night before, on the phone, that she needed to do that part by herself. He'd understood immediately, and said so, because the understanding wasn't complicated. This was her account, her body, her chair, her night at the reservoir. He had been a witness. She had been the person it happened to. Those were different positions, and they required different kinds of presence in the room. She came back from it and texted him one line, "Done." Ruth says it went well. He texted back, "Good." 3 dots appeared, then, "She asked me about Claire." He waited. Deming. "She asked who I'd call after the incident. I said I hadn't called anyone. She asked if there was someone I would have called. I said my sister. She asked where my sister was." He read it twice. "I said she died 3 weeks ago, and that's partly why I was at the reservoir that night." And Deming just nodded and wrote it down and moved on, which was the right thing to do. "And also I cried in a state investigator's office, which was not what I had planned." He thought about what to say. He wrote, "That's not a problem. I know. It's just, I wanted to hold it together in there. You went in, you gave your account, you were honest. That's holding it together." A long pause. Then, "Yeah. Okay." Then, Sandra called me after her interview. She said Deming asked her about the follow-up visit to her house. In detail. She said it felt like they already knew about it. Grant looked at that message for a moment. "They probably did," he wrote. "Rice had a separate file. I saw it when I was in there. It was thicker than it should have been for just my interview." What does that mean? It means someone did their homework before they drove up from Boise. Us. The suspension hit the local paper 4 days later. Not the Helena Ridge Gazette, which was a weekly and had the institutional caution of a paper that existed in the same community as the people it might need to write about. A regional outlet, the Western Idaho Tribune, which ran it as a 3-paragraph news item on page 8. County deputy suspended amid state investigation of conduct complaints. It named Price. It did not name Leah or Sandra. It described the state attorney general's inquiry as reviewing multiple complaints spanning several years, and noted that at least one incident involved alleged use of force. The sheriff's office had declined to comment except to confirm the suspension. Grant read it over coffee on a Thursday morning and then put the paper down and sat with it for a while. Not satisfaction, exactly. He'd examined that possibility over the past few weeks. Whether what he was feeling when the process moved correctly was something like satisfaction, something like vindication. And he'd found that it wasn't quite either of those things. It was closer to the feeling he'd had at the end of certain operations that had gone correctly. Not triumph, because the work hadn't been about triumph, but a specific quietness. The quietness of a thing that needed doing having been done. He was aware that the process wasn't finished. Suspension wasn't resolution. An investigation wasn't a verdict. And whatever happened to Price, the 5 or 6 people who'd been on the receiving end of his particular approach over 8 years had already lived through their versions of that November night. Some of them multiple times. And the institutional outcome didn't undo that. But it was something. It was at the very least a different story than the one Price had written in his reports. Bishop came and sat beside his chair and put his head on Grant's knee, which he did sometimes in the mornings for no apparent reason other than he wanted to. "Yeah," Grant said, to nobody in particular. The call from Lieutenant Garza came on a Friday. Grant almost didn't pick up, unknown local number, but something made him answer, and the voice on the other end identified itself as Supervisor Lieutenant Dale Garza of the Helena Ridge County Sheriff's Department and asked if Grant Rourke had a few minutes. He said he did. Garza's voice was measured and careful, the voice of someone who had spent a career navigating between institutional loyalty and the moments when institutional loyalty ran out of road. He said he understood Grant had been interviewed by the state investigators. He said he wasn't calling about that. He said he was calling because he had something he wanted to say that wasn't official and wasn't on record, and that Grant could take however he wanted to take it. Go ahead, Grant said. When Price filed his initial report on the November 7th incident, Garza said, I read it, and I thought, I've read a lot of Price's reports over 8 years, and this one felt like the others. Careful, considered, covering specific ground. A pause. I've had concerns about Nolan for a while. I'd been told those concerns weren't that the situation was being handled at a level above me. The sheriff, Grant said. A silence. I'm not on record, Garza said. You just called a civilian witness on your personal phone during an active state investigation. You understand that has implications. I'm aware. Another pause. I wanted to say what you did at the reservoir, staying, talking to us, the documentation. He stopped. It mattered. The way it was put together, it made it harder for things to go the way they usually go. Grant thought about what he was hearing. He thought about Garza's position. Not a bad man, probably, but a man who had spent years inside a department shaped by someone who protected the wrong people, and who had made the calculations that institutional positions required, and had mostly landed on the wrong side of them, and was now, with the investigation running, trying to find a way to be on the right side of something. He didn't say any of that. Thank you for calling, Lieutenant, he said. Is there something you need from me? A pause. No, Garza said. No. That's all. Okay. He walked into you in that parking lot, Garza said, almost as an afterthought. Price, whatever you did, he walked out of there on his own 2 feet. I just want you to know I noted that. He made a choice, Grant said. I didn't need him to be hurt. I needed him to stop. A longer pause. Yeah, Garza said quietly. He stopped. Yeah. He hung up. Grant sat with the phone on the table. His shoulder was aching at the joint in the particular way that meant the weather was shifting. There was a system coming in from the northwest, according to the forecast, the first real winter storm of the season. He rotated the shoulder slowly, working through the range, and thought about the call and what it meant. What it meant, as best he could tell, was that the walls were coming down faster than Price had anticipated, and that the people who had been propping them up were now positioning themselves to be on the other side of where they'd been standing. That was how it worked. It wasn't admirable, but it was useful, because it meant the institutional protection that had absorbed 5 complaints over 8 years was no longer absorbing anything. He wrote a note about the call. Time, duration, who had called, what had been said. He dated it. He sent it to Ruth. Her response came back in 6 minutes. I'll flag it. Don't call him back. He had no intention of calling Garza back. He had no interest in Garza's complicated feelings about his own institutional history. What he had interest in was the 4 people, including Leah, who had their names attached to complaints that had been dismissed without individual review, and whatever happened next that might make that mean something. The storm arrived Sunday night. It came in the way Idaho winter storms came, without a great deal of warning and with complete commitment. By Monday morning, there were 8 inches of new snow on the ground. The road behind the cabin was passable, but barely, and the pine trees outside the window were the white-loaded shapes that looked like something from a picture, but felt, when you were actually in it, like the world had contracted to the distance you could see. Grant shoveled the drive. His shoulder reported its opinion of shoveling clearly, and he worked through it and finished and stood at the top of the drive breathing hard, the steam rising from him in the cold, Bishop watching from the porch, with the expression of a dog who considered this to be a voluntary activity and therefore outside the bounds of sympathy. His phone buzzed. Ruth. He peeled off a glove and answered. The sheriff's office issued a statement this morning, she said. Price has been formally terminated pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. Grant held the phone. His breath made clouds. Criminal, he said. The state AG's office has escalated. The parking lot incident you described, combined with the restriction notice, which they've determined was filed using a procedure that required supervisor sign-off that was never obtained, combined with the prior complaint pattern. They're looking at misconduct charges, possibly witness intimidation, possibly more depending on what the 2018 case surfaces. And the sheriff? A pause, longer than the others. The sheriff announced he will not seek re-election in next year's cycle, Ruth said. He made a statement this morning about his commitment to transparency and his confidence in the state process. He did not mention Price by name. Grant looked at the snow-covered drive. At the road beyond it, white and quiet. He's stepping back before it gets to him directly. He's stepping back before the state decides whether his name appears in the same document as Price's in a context that would be relevant to his holding a public office, Ruth said. Yes. He thought about Garza. About I've had concerns about Nolan for a while. I'd been told those concerns weren't being handled. Told by whom? Ruth, he said, Leah needs to hear this from you, not me. I'm calling her next. Okay. Grant. She paused. I've been practicing law in Idaho for 22 years. Cases like this, with this documentation, this witness cooperation, this trajectory, they don't usually move this fast. Usually, it's a year of process before anything formal happens. The documentation was thorough, he said. The documentation was exceptional, she said. Don't be modest about it. It's not a becoming quality in this context. He almost smiled. I had a good teacher, he said. The Navy? Pattern recognition, he said. Understanding what evidence is before someone tells you it matters. She said she'd be in touch. He hung up. He stood in the drive for another minute, in the cold and the snow and the quietness of a Monday morning after a storm, and he looked at the mountains that were half hidden in the cloud cover and were there anyway, solid and indifferent and completely uninterested in whether any of this was happening below them. He thought about Leah at the reservoir that first night, the charcoal coat, the hands folded in her lap, the specific shape of a person who had come to the edge of something dark and was sitting with it, not because she was weak, but because grief didn't organize itself around convenience. He thought about what she'd said. I wasn't doing anything wrong. She hadn't been. She'd been sitting at a reservoir in a closed park 20 minutes after sunset, grieving her sister. And a man with a badge had decided that her existence in that space, her steadiness under his pressure, her refusal to simply accommodate him, was a problem he had the authority to solve with his hands. And he'd done it because he'd been doing it, in one form or another, for 8 years. And the department had made its calculations and had decided, 8 years running, that the cost of addressing it was higher than the cost of looking away. The cost to the department, not the cost to Sandra Runningwater, standing at her own door at 8:47 at night with her hands not quite steady. Not the cost to the people in 2018 and 2019 whose names Grant still didn't fully know. Not the cost to a 25-year-old woman in a charcoal coat lying on frozen pavement with her palms bleeding and the dark reservoir behind her and nobody around except a man 50 yards away that nobody would have thought to count on. He picked up his shovel. He went inside. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and opened the legal pad to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top, the way he always did, because the habit of documentation was not something he intended to stop. Bishop came and settled under the table, which he did when the weather was cold and the floor was warm. Outside, the snow kept coming. The mountains were still there behind the clouds. And the file with Price's name on it was sitting, at that exact moment, on a desk in Boise that was not going to put it down. The snow kept falling through Monday and into Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning it had stopped and the world outside the cabin was the specific white silence that came after a real storm. Not peaceful exactly, more like the world had been paused mid-sentence and was waiting to see if anyone would finish the thought. Grant was on his second cup of coffee when Ruth called again. Not about Price this time, about something adjacent to Price, which was the question of what happened to the people who had been inside the process that protected him. The sheriff's announcement of non-re-election had, Ruth explained, triggered a chain of events that moved faster than anyone had publicly predicted. The county commissioner's office had opened its own review of complaint dismissal procedures. 2 deputies who had been present during some of the incidents under review had made voluntary statements to the state investigators, which Ruth described as unusual, and which Grant understood to mean that the institutional loyalty calculus had shifted completely, that the people who had been quietly deferring to the prevailing culture were now reading the situation correctly and acting accordingly. What about the complaints that were dismissed? Grant asked. The ones from 2018, 2019, 2021. The AG's office has reached out to those complainants, or is in the process of reaching out. I can't speak to what remedies look like yet. Civil is a different conversation. A pause. But for the purposes of the criminal investigation, they're witnesses now, not dismissed complaints. Witnesses. He held the phone and looked out the window at the white drive. That matters, he said. It matters enormously, Ruth said. It means the record is being corrected in the place where it was falsified. After he hung up, he sat for a long time without doing much of anything. Bishop was asleep under the table. The cabin was warm. The snow outside had the quality of something that had settled in for the duration, and the mountains were fully visible this morning. The storm had cleared the atmosphere and left everything sharp and close-looking. The ridgeline defined against a blue sky that had the particular intensity of altitude in winter. He thought about what Ruth had said. The record is being corrected in the place where it was falsified. He'd spent 14 years in environments where the record mattered more than almost anything else, where what was documented, what was logged, what was put in the after action and signed off on, formed the skeleton of what was officially true. He'd also spent 14 years watching the gap between what was officially true and what had actually happened be managed, negotiated, occasionally exploited. Not always maliciously, sometimes just because the people writing the record were tired or scared or operating under pressures that pointed in a certain direction, and the record bent the way tired and scared people bent it. What he'd built over the past 6 weeks, the legal pad, the time-stamped emails, the photographs, the contemporaneous accounts, was a counter-record, a parallel documentation of the same events from a vantage point that had no institutional stake in the outcome. It was, when he thought about it clearly, the thing he was most actually good at outside of the operational skills. Not the tactical ability to redirect a man's elbow at a parking lot barrier. The ability to observe accurately, document completely, and construct an account that didn't rely on authority for its credibility. He'd had good teachers. He'd had instructors who drilled the after-action report with the same intensity they drilled room-clearing techniques, because they understood that what happened in the field was only half the mission. The other half was being able to say, clearly and completely, exactly what had occurred. He opened the legal pad to a fresh page. He wrote the date. He sat with the pen in his hand for a moment. Then he wrote, "Next steps." He looked at what he'd written. It was the first time in 6 months he'd written those words in reference to anything that wasn't immediate or reactive. It was the first time since he'd driven into Helena Ridge with an injured shoulder and a German shepherd and a general intention to be somewhere quiet that he'd thought about what came after the quiet. He underlined it once. Then he started writing. Leah called at noon. "Ruth talked to me this morning," she said. "I know, she called me first. She said the complainants from the prior cases are being brought into the investigation officially." A pause. "Sandra called me right." She was... Another pause. Longer. She was crying. Not bad crying. The other kind. He knew what she meant. "How are you?" he asked. A silence. The kind she had when she was deciding how honest to be. "I don't know how to feel about it," she said. "I thought I would feel, I don't know, more, or differently. I thought when it actually moved, when something actually happened, I'd feel like it was over. It's not over. I know that. The investigation is still running. There's going to be more process. But I mean," she stopped. "I thought I'd feel better, and I do feel better. I just also feel tired, and I keep thinking about my sister." He didn't try to resolve that for her. "That makes sense," he said. "Does it?" "Yeah, the thing you were fighting it on top of grief. When the fight starts to resolve, the grief is still there. It was always there. It just had less room." A long silence. "That's," she started, stopped. "Yeah, that's exactly what it is." Claire would have been in the middle of all of this, he said. It was the first time he'd brought up her sister directly, and he wasn't entirely sure why he did it now, except that it felt true. And true was the standard he'd been holding everything to. Driving you to the attorney's office, calling you after every meeting, making you eat dinner on the nights you forgot. A sound from her end of the phone. Small, compressed. She would have driven Deming absolutely insane, Leah said, and there was something in her voice that was wet and real, and not quite a laugh and not quite crying. Just the sound of a person who missed someone specifically. She would have had opinions, so many opinions, about the process, about Ruth, about whether the statement was worded strongly enough. She would have been right about most of them, Grant said. She would have been right about all of them. A pause. She really would have liked you. He didn't answer right away. He looked at the window, at the ridge, at the sharp blue sky. I know, he said. January came in with the particular ruthlessness of Idaho January, temperatures that made the November cold seem like a mild suggestion, the days short and the nights long, and the snow on the ground permanent now rather than occasional. Helena Ridge contracted into itself the way small towns did in hard winters, the streets quieter, the diners fuller during the shoulder hours when people needed somewhere warm to be. Grant started running trails with the county search and rescue team. It had begun almost by accident. He'd stopped to help a volunteer group that was doing a training exercise on a trail near the Eastern Preserve, and their team lead, a woman named Carol Briggs, who was in her early 60s and had the physical fitness of someone 20 years younger and the impatience of someone who'd been doing this long enough to know exactly what worked and what didn't, had watched him assist a trainee through a technical descent and then turned to him and said very directly, "Do you want to do this for real?" He'd thought about it for approximately 3 seconds. "Yes," he said. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now he was out on the trails twice a week with Carol's team, learning their protocols, their radio procedures, their grid search methods, some of which were solid, some of which were things he could see clear improvements to without saying so yet, because you didn't walk into someone else's established team and immediately start suggesting revisions. You learned the system first, you showed up, you carried your weight. Then, after enough time had passed that you'd earned the standing to say something, you said it. Bishop came on the trail exercises. Carol had asked about him the first session, with the professional curiosity of someone who understood working dogs. "Military?" she asked, crouching to let Bishop assess her hand. "K9, 9 years active." "What's he cleared for?" "Tracking, area search, cadaver, though I'd keep him off cadaver work at this point. He's 12. I don't want to put him back in that headspace if it's not necessary." Carol had looked at Bishop the way people who understood dogs looked at dogs they were taking the measure of. "Can he still track?" "On a good day, yeah. Not the way he did at 5, but still." "We'll see," she said. And Bishop had apparently passed whatever test she was running because she'd never questioned his presence again. The work was different from anything Grant had done before, which was part of why it worked for him. He'd spent his career going to places to do specific high-stakes things to specific people or objectives. Search and rescue was the inverse of that. You went to places to find people, to bring them back, to take someone from the column of lost and move them to the column of found. The stakes were the same kind of stakes, but the direction was entirely different, and that difference did something to the part of him that had been trying to figure out what came after the operational part. After 2 weeks, Carol told him there was a volunteer coordinator position opening up on the team, someone to handle training schedules, equipment, coordination with county emergency services. "You're not asking because I'm the newest member," he said. "I'm asking because you built a documentation system for our grid search protocols in your first week that's better than what we've been using for 6 years," she said. "And because Bishop found a scent trace in the north sector that our lead dog missed." She paused. "And because you show up when you say you're going to show up, which sounds like a low bar until you've managed volunteers for 20 years. He took the position. He told Leah about it at the Eastern Preserve on a Thursday in mid-January, the temperature sitting at 11 degrees, and neither of them particularly bothered by it at this point. She'd been coming to the Eastern Preserve since the restriction notice had been issued, and even after Ruth had confirmed in late December that the notice had been formally rescinded as part of the administrative review, procedurally irregular, issued without proper authority, nullified. Leah had kept coming east. "You could go back to Alder Creek," he said. "I know." She watched Bishop pick his way through a crust of snow at the trail's edge. "I might, eventually." A pause. "This trail is better. You said that the first night we came here." "I was right then, too." He told her about the coordinator position. She listened without interrupting, which was something he'd noticed about her. She didn't fill silences prematurely. She let things land before she responded to them. "That's good," she said when he finished. "That's really good. It's volunteer work. The pay is—" "I know what search and rescue volunteer coordinators make, Grant. That's not what I meant." She looked at him. "I meant it's good that you found a thing to do, a reason to be here." He looked at the trail ahead. "Yeah," he said. "I think it is." The criminal charges against Price were formally filed on the 14th of January. Ruth called Grant at 8 in the morning to read him the summary. Misconduct in office, violation of civil rights under color of law. 2 counts, one for Leah, one for Sandra running water. Witness intimidation, 1 count, for the parking lot incident. Abuse of authority. The charges were accompanied by a civil complaint filed jointly by Ruth on behalf of Leah and Sandra, naming Price individually, and in what Ruth described as the part with the most structural teeth, naming the county for institutional failure in the complaint dismissal process. The civil case will take longer, Ruth said. That's just the reality. But the criminal filing is public, which means the record is public, which means anyone who searches Nolan Price's name from this point forward will find these charges. How's Leah taking it? She's the one who called me last night to make sure the filing was going to happen on schedule, Ruth said. How do you think she's taking it? He almost smiled. He drove to Leah's apartment that afternoon. Not because she'd asked him to, she hadn't, but because some things didn't need to be coordinated. She answered the door in jeans and a gray sweater, her hair down, and stepped back to let him in without saying anything, which meant she'd been expecting him, or someone like him. The apartment was small and well organized, the layout adjusted around her needs, in ways that were practical and personal. Lower counters in the kitchen, the furniture arranged to leave clear paths, a large wall of bookshelves that took up the entire east side of the living room and had not an inch of empty space on it. He looked at the books. History, mostly. Some science. A long shelf of legal and policy texts that he recognized as the reading of someone who had been doing research for a specific purpose. How long have you been looking into disability rights law? He asked. She was in the kitchen, filling 2 glasses of water with the competent efficiency of someone moving through a space they'd adapted completely. Since the accident, she said, 3 years ago. She came out and handed him a glass. I figured if I was going to live inside this system, I should understand how it worked, which parts protected me and which parts just thought they did. And there's more gap than most people think. She settled into position near the couch. The law says certain things. The enforcement of those things depends entirely on whether the people in the room take it seriously. A pause. Which, as it turns out, they frequently don't. He sat in the chair across from her. What are you going to do with that? She looked at him. What do you mean? You've spent 3 years studying the gap between what the law says and what actually happens to disabled people navigating institutions. You just went through the most direct possible version of that gap. And you've been, he thought about how to put it. You've been helping people, Sandra. Ruth mentioned you'd been in contact with 2 of the other complainants, helping them understand the process. She was quiet for a moment. There's an advocacy organization in Boise, she said. They work with disabled residents on exactly this kind of thing. Institutional access, complaint navigation, documentation when law enforcement is involved. She looked at her glass. They reached out after the filing became public. They'd seen my name in the story. They asked if I'd be interested in talking. About what? About whether I'd want to work with them. In some capacity. She set the glass down. I haven't answered yet. Why not? Because I don't know if I want to leave Helena Ridge. She said it plainly, without particular decoration. I've been here 4 years. This is where Claire is buried. This is where the reservoir is. A pause. This is where you are. He looked at her. She met his eyes without looking away, which was something she did. She didn't deflect difficult things. She just held them in the open and let them be what they were. The work doesn't have to be in Boise, he said. That kind of work, documentation work, advocacy work, it happens everywhere, especially in places where the nearest organization is 3 hours away and the people who need help are here. She was quiet for a long moment. Is that your way of saying stay? It's my way of saying the place you're looking for might already be where you are. She looked at her bookshelf, at the 3 years of research, at the wall of information she'd built to understand the system she was living inside. I'm going to call them back tomorrow, she said, and ask if the work could be done from here. Good. And if they say no, then you know something about whether they're the right organization. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that had several things in it. Something like warmth, something like the specific recognition of a person who has found, Unexpectedly, and not entirely comfortably, someone who says true things. "You're not great at the soft landing," she said. "No," he agreed. "I know." "It's fine," she said. "I don't need a soft landing." What? February brought a thaw that lasted 4 days, and then a freeze that locked everything down harder than before, and in the middle of that freeze, the state attorney general's office announced that its investigation had been expanded to include the sheriff's role in complaint oversight. The announcement was 2 paragraphs in the regional paper and a longer piece in the Boise outlet that had been following the case since the suspension. The sheriff did not comment. His attorney issued a statement that said his client was cooperating fully with all inquiries. Leah had seen the announcement before Grant had, and her text arrived while he was in the middle of a search and rescue training exercise in the North Sector with Bishop and 2 newer volunteers. "Did you see the AG announcement? He read it during a water break." Wrote back, "Just saw it." "Okay? Yeah, it's weird. It keeps expanding. Like, I thought it was about one night at a reservoir." He thought about how to answer that. He wrote, "It was." And then it turned out that one night was part of something bigger. "That's not weird. That's just what happens when you finally look." A pause. Claire would have had something to say about that. What would she have said? A longer pause. She would have said, "See? I told you that you were the right person for this." And she would have been annoyingly right. He looked at that for a moment, at the white trail ahead of him, at Bishop sitting patiently in the snow with his gray muzzle turned into the wind. She was right, he wrote back. He put the phone away and called the volunteers back to the grid. On the last Thursday in February, Leah went back to Alder Creek. She didn't tell anyone she was going, not Grant, not Sandra, not the woman from the advocacy organization in Boise she'd been talking to twice a week since January, who had turned out to be willing to support remote work from Helena Ridge, and who had asked Leah to take on a case coordination role that was, in practical terms, exactly what she'd been doing informally for the past 2 months. She drove herself, parked in the lot where the lights now worked at all hours because the County Parks Administration had finally fixed the timer that had been broken for a year and a half. She deployed her ramp, she got in the chair, she wheeled to the trailhead. The restriction notice was gone, which she already knew from Ruth's December confirmation, but there was something different about knowing it from a document and seeing the gate clear and the trail open and no piece of paper telling her she wasn't allowed to be somewhere she had a right to be. She wheeled down the trail. The path was packed snow, not ice, and her chair handled it with some effort. She'd put on the winter tires, the wider ones with the grip pattern, back in December. The cottonwoods on either side were bare and gray, and the reservoir was visible through the gaps in the trees before she reached the curve, dark water under a February sky that was the particular blue-white of a cold afternoon going toward evening. She reached the spot. Her spot. The place where the trail curved and opened and the reservoir was right there, the far tree line reflected in the black water, the mountain ridge above it going purple in the failing light. She stopped. She sat for a moment, just breathing, listening to the sound of the water and the wind and a single bird somewhere in the cottonwoods that she couldn't identify and didn't try to. 3.5 months since she'd been here, since the charcoal coat and the dark November evening and the sound of Deputy Nolan Price's hand closing around the push handle of her chair. The same reservoir, the same trail, the same cold. Everything else was different. Price had a court date in April. His attorney had entered a not guilty plea, which Ruth had expected and which would mean a process that stretched for months and might go to trial. The civil case was slower. The county was in discussions, Ruth's language carefully neutral, about the systemic remedies that the administrative review had identified as necessary. The sheriff had quietly hired an attorney of his own. None of that was finished. None of it would be finished for a long time, and some of it would resolve in ways that weren't satisfying, and some of it would resolve correctly and slowly, and some of it would turn on details and technicalities that had nothing to do with what had actually happened on a cold November night when a man had decided that his badge was permission. But the record was there. All of it, in the correct order, in the words of the people it had happened to, time-stamped and signed and sent to the right desks. Leah sat beside the reservoir and thought about Claire, not the way she'd been thinking about her in the first weeks, the desperate, reaching kind of thinking, where you were trying to keep the voice clear in your memory because you were afraid it was already starting to fade. This was different, calmer, The way you thought about someone who was part of you in a structural way, built into how you understood things, always going to be there in the architecture, even if they weren't in the room. You're still you. The chair doesn't change that. Don't let anyone tell you different. She hadn't let anyone tell her different. She had, in fact, made it significantly more difficult for someone to tell the next person different. She stayed for 20 minutes, maybe a little more. Then she heard footsteps on the trail, the specific rhythm of a man who walked like he was conserving energy without being aware of it, and Bishop's nails on the packed snow. She turned around. Grant stopped a few feet back, the way he always stopped, not hovering, just present. Bishop moved past him to Leah immediately, unhesitating, and put his head against her knee. She put her hand on his muzzle. The gray fur was winter-thick and warm. "How did you know I was here?" she asked. "I didn't," he said. "I come here on Thursdays." She looked at him. "You've been coming here even when I was using the Eastern Preserve?" "I like the reservoir," he said. She held his gaze for a moment and understood that this was true, and also that it wasn't the whole truth, and that he was not going to explain the rest of it because the rest of it was in the category of things he communicated by continuing to show up rather than by saying them. She turned back to the water. He came and stood beside her, not quite at the railing, looking at the same black reservoir she was looking at. Bishop moved between them in the comfortable territorial way of a dog who had claimed two people and was satisfied with the arrangement. "I called them today," she said. "The organization officially said yes." "Good. It's part-time to start, remote. I'll be handling documentation assistance, helping people in rural counties understand how to build a record when they're dealing with institutional pushback, complaint navigation, that kind of thing." She paused. "Turns out the thing I did to survive the last 3 months is actually a skill set." "It's always been a skill set," he said. "You just had to use it." She was quiet for a moment. "The advocacy director said something on the call today." She said, Leah stopped, thinking about the exact wording. She said most people who come through something like this come out wanting to forget it. They want to close the file and move on. She said the rare ones come out wanting to make sure the next person has a shorter fight. A pause. "She said I was clearly one of the rare ones." "She's right." "I don't know if I'm rare," Leah said. I know what it felt like to be on the ground in this parking lot with nobody around. And I know what it felt like to find out that there had been 5 people before me who'd felt the same thing, and nobody had listened." Her voice was level, not performing anything, just stating it. "I can't unknow that, so I might as well do something with it." The water moved slightly in the wind. A ripple crossed the reservoir and flattened, and was gone. "What about you?" she asked. "The coordinator position. Is that something you're actually staying for?" He looked at the water. "I've been trying to figure out since I got here whether Idaho was a destination or a stop," he said. "Whether I came here to end up somewhere or just to stop being somewhere else." He paused. "I think it's a destination." "Because of the search and rescue work?" "Partly." She looked at him. "I was looking at the reservoir." "Grant." "Yeah." "You can just say it." A silence. The specific kind that he was better at than most people. The kind that didn't feel like avoidance, but like he was actually thinking. "I came here to disappear," he said. "I'd been what I did for a long time. It requires you to be very good at not existing, at moving through places without leaving marks. And when I got out, I didn't know how to stop doing that." He paused. 6 months of not existing in a town where nobody knew my name and nobody needed me for anything." He looked at the ridge, and then I heard a wheelchair hit frozen pavement. The cottonwoods moved in the wind. "And now?" she said. "Now I'm the volunteer coordinator for the county search and rescue team," he said. "I have a documentation system that Carol says is the best they've had in 20 years. I have a reason to be on the trails in the morning." He paused. "And on Thursday evenings." She looked at him for a long moment, his profile against the dark water, the ridge, the last of the light. "Bishop picked me first," she said. "He has better instincts than I do." "In some areas," she said. He looked at her then. She was already looking at him, the way she did, directly, without the deflection that most people use to manage the discomfort of being seen. He had never, in 14 years of operational life and 6 months of deliberate invisibility, been looked at quite the way Leah Carver looked at him, which was like he was a fact she had already verified and didn't need to keep checking. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. It was a simple sentence. He meant it completely. Good, she said. Bishop moved between them one more time and sat down with great deliberation, as if placing himself at the exact midpoint of the universe and finding it acceptable. The three of them stayed at the reservoir until the light was almost gone, and then Leah turned her chair and Grant walked beside her back up the trail to the parking lot, and Bishop moved ahead of them with the authority of an old dog who had decided where everyone was going and was just waiting for the humans to catch up. The criminal proceedings against Price ran into spring and then summer the way legal processes did, grinding through continuances and motions and the slow machinery of a system that was, at its best, thorough and at its worst, exhausting. In June, Price accepted a plea agreement, 2 of the 5 charges, misconduct and 1 count of rights violation, with the witness intimidation count factored into sentencing recommendations. He would not serve prison time under the agreement, which was the part that wasn't satisfying, and he would carry the criminal record and the permanent loss of his law enforcement certification, which was the part that mattered for the future. Ruth called Leah with the news. Leah called Grant. He was on a trail with Bishop and 2 volunteers running a grid search exercise, and he stepped off the trail to take the call and stood in the pine trees and listened. It's not everything, Leah said. No. He's not going to prison. I know. A silence. But he's done, she said. He can't be a cop anywhere, ever. And the county paid into the civil settlement in April, which means there's a formal institutional acknowledgement that the complaint dismissal process was broken. She stopped. Ruth says that's actually the more important piece, structurally, because it creates a record that future cases can point to. She's right, Grant said. I know she's right. Another pause. I wanted to feel more satisfied. You built something that will protect people you've never met, he said. That doesn't always feel the way you think it should. No, she said. It doesn't. The volunteers were looking at him from the trail. He held up one finger. Leah. Yeah. Claire would have been satisfied. A long silence. She really would have been, she said quietly. And then, with a sound in her voice that was close enough to peace that it counted, yeah, she would have. By October, a year had passed since the night at the reservoir, and the world had rearranged itself in the particular way that worlds rearranged themselves after something real had moved through them. Not clean, not perfectly resolved, but different in ways that held. Leah was full-time with the advocacy organization by September. She had, in the space of 9 months, helped 14 people in 4 counties build documentation that made their complaints harder to dismiss. 3 of those cases were still in process. 2 had already resulted in policy changes at the department level. The rest were somewhere in the long middle of institutional change, which moved slowly and required patience and the willingness to maintain accurate records over time. She had been asked to speak at a state-level disability advocacy conference in November. She'd said yes, and had spent 3 weeks trying to write the speech, and had finally put the legal pad down and told Grant, who was sitting at her kitchen table with coffee and a county search and rescue equipment inventory, he was trying to simplify, that she didn't know how to say it. Say what? He said without looking up. Any of it. How to explain what happened without it sounding like a story about me, when it's supposed to be about what the system does and how to fight it. Tell them about Sandra, he said. She looked at him. Tell them about the night Sandra went home after the traffic stop. The text she sent her cousin at 8:47. He set down the inventory. Tell them what that text means as evidence, what it would have meant if she'd known to preserve it, what it means now that she did. Don't start with yourself. Start with the mechanism. Leah sat with that for a moment. A year after the charcoal coat and the dark reservoir and the sound of a wheelchair on frozen pavement, 3 people went back to Alder Creek. It was a Saturday morning. The sky was clear, the light thin and bright, the first frost already on the ground, the leaves stripped from the cottonwoods and lying flat and brown along the edges of the trail. The reservoir was perfectly still. The mountains were out, the whole ridge visible and sharp the way it only was in fall. The distances collapsed to something almost reachable. Leah's wheels made a dry sound on the path. Bishop moved ahead of them in his old man's walk, deliberate, choosing his steps, but his nose was working. You could see it in the way he moved, the slight weaving, the attention directed at things invisible to everyone else. 12 years old and still present, still the most focused creature in any given space. Grant walked beside her. They reached the spot, the place where the trail curved and opened, the place where the pavement had been scuffed in a pattern that winter and spring and summer had long since erased, the place where she had been on the ground and he had been 50 yards away, and Bishop had gone still. They stopped. Nothing dramatic happened. The reservoir was the reservoir. The mountains were the mountains. The cottonwoods had lost their leaves and would grow them back in April, and lose them again, and that cycle was indifferent to everything that had occurred within sight of it. "It looks the same," Leah said. "Yeah. I thought it might feel different." "Does it?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. "It feels like mine again," she said. "It didn't for a while." A pause. "Now it does." He looked at the ridge, at the water, at Bishop, who had found something of interest at the trail's edge and was investigating it with the seriousness of an old professional who didn't cut corners. "Good," he said. They stayed for a while, not 20 minutes this time, longer. Bishop eventually abandoned his investigation and came back to sit between them in the sun, and the three of them were quiet together in the way of people who had been through something hard and had come out the other side and no longer needed to talk about it to know it was real. The frost on the ground caught the morning light. The reservoir held the sky. And somewhere in Helena Ridge, in a county that was in the slow, imperfect, resistant process of becoming something slightly more accountable than what it had been, the record remained, complete, time-stamped, and harder to erase than the people who'd benefited from its absence had ever imagined. There are people in this world who walk past when someone is on the ground. And then there are people who stop, not because they're fearless, not because they're certain, but because walking past is a choice they can't live with. That choice, made once, in a cold parking lot, by a man nobody was looking at, and a dog who had already decided, turned out to be the thing that changed everything. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to look away.